This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breach Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Gwyn K., Politi, Caitlin N., John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Gabby, Helen M., Ruth S., Sunny H., Scott K., JR M., and Phil J. I really appreciate those of you who have joined and who have stuck with me over these years. After years of being pulled in too many directions, I'm now focusing on building a community in which I can offer classes, live discussions, personal mentoring, and swag. Check out patreon.com/Chthonia to see the benefits of each level. At the $1 level, you can get early access to these podcasts, some free swag, and personal shoutouts just like you heard. At the $5 level and above, you're eligible for free mini courses with me. A full list of current courses is under my website posts at chthonia.net. When we have a bigger group, there will also be access to Discord, where I would like to have live streams of classes and special groups for new witches working with the dark goddesses, for those who want to go more deeply into the myth and folklore of the dark feminine, and a writers group for those creating fiction or poetry about the dark feminine. Can't do it without you, so please consider joining today at patreon.com/Chthonia. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breach Burke. This week we have a rather interesting and very broad subject that has a lot of, there was a lot of potential directions we could go in when talking about it, because it is a type of being that we see not only in our, not only in the European Western context religiously, but also something that we see in folklore from around the world. And the idea is a very old one. And this is the idea of the succubus. Okay. Now, succubus is the definition of a succubus, the actual formal definition, is a female demon that is believed to have sexual intercourse with sleeping men. Now, the male counterpart to the succubus is known as the incubus. And I need to keep the incubus in mind for this because these two work in tandem. Okay, they have kind of a racket going in terms of what they're actually trying to achieve. And supposedly what they are trying to achieve, the female succubus is harvesting semen from men that then is given to the incubus, who then uses it to impregnate women. Now, according to the theology of this, let's just say the witch hunters manuals, which we're going to talk about, there's really two different reasons for this. There's two different types of victims of succubi and incubi. And one is people who are just innocent men and women who are just sleeping, minding their own business, and this happens to them. The other are those who are involved in witchcraft. Okay, because obviously the witchy connection, sometimes it can be connected to means of trying to draw young girls, especially young virgin girls, into witchcraft. And it can also be about the types of rites that were supposed to occur when a woman became a witch and signed her soul over to the devil. Okay, so there was this element to that as well. So all of this is interesting because there's a lot in church theology that spent time covering this. Because as we are all, maybe we're all aware, if you're not aware, there was this big event in Europe throughout the Middle Ages known as the Inquisition. And the Inquisition was where heretics were taken by the church, those who committed heresy against whatever the doctrine is. And again, there are varying degrees of how heinous of a sin somebody committed or how heinous of a violation. But all of these violations lead to, ultimately, depending on the type of violation, would be what kind of a punishment you would have. For things that connected to this, especially things connected to witchcraft, in which usually the person who was accused of being a witch, and probably in many cases probably wasn't actually a witch, or they were still practicing some kind of an old pagan rite. They may have been midwives. That's a whole subject in and of itself. Those who were accused of witchcraft, or those who were the victims of an inquisition. And so it's so the Inquisition, what typically would happen to you at the end is usually you basically were killed. There were means of testing for witches, how someone was a witch, like, dunking people in water. And, if they drowned, then they were obviously innocent. And if they floated, then they were a witch and they were going to be burned at stake or hung or, depending on where you were. There's one of the things, actually, when we talk about the witch trials in America, a lot of times people say that, people were burned at the stake, but that never actually happened in the United States, or what was previously the English colonies in the Americas. That women instead were hung, okay, or they, maybe even tortured to death. In one case at least one case, somebody was pressed to death. That was Giles Corey. Yeah, that was in Salem, Massachusetts, who was a man. So, so this idea of, it says heresy was considered to be something, this type of heresy was this dealing with the devil. The way that the church viewed this was that they were actually helping you, okay? They were, somehow you were going to have the devil was going to steal, the devil, you were on the path to going to hell. The devil was going to steal your soul. It was going to take you, presumably I'm never quite sure. This is always one of those weird things. Christianity is not a dualistic religion, okay? It's a monotheistic religion. There's one God, and that God's in charge of everything. Right? So this idea that there's almost this army of darkness that is associated with the devil that's there to take the souls of people, I'm like, that was always kind of a weird dualistic concept to me. It's like, okay, you're saying that there's still this battle being fought between good and evil, even though somebody supposedly took baptism or whatever, received communion, and that individual was, by virtue of doing that, is saved. But of course, that's another rabbit hole of theology, because it's like kind of like, yeah, you are, and no, you're not. I mean, there's still the whole idea of free will and what else, that you might do, to mess up that thing that you have. There's a lot throughout church history about that whole idea. Nonetheless, okay, bottom line is this. You are, in some fashion, you are either being preyed upon by the devil, or you are being recruited to this sort of army of darkness through these very carnal desires, which of course we all know are supposed to be very, very bad. And, and this idea of sins of the flesh, which is very much connected to our ideas about witchcraft, because they're tied to not only sex, but also bearing children or not being able to bear children. One of the things, excuse me, that I found very interesting as I was reading through some of these texts is particularly the Malleus Maleficarum, which I'm going to actually read some from that, and I'll explain that text if you've never heard of it, is the idea that what the devil does is it has means of keeping women from procreating. Okay, so when you think about later ideas about birth control and the way in which the church was so opposed to it, and the way you had all these horror movies about, women who take charge of their own sexuality and they produce these monstrous kinds of creatures. And I've talked about this in other places before. There is a book called Monsters in America by W. Scott Poole, which I refer to this book a lot, but it was a really interesting treatise on horror movies. And he talks specifically about this. And most people will get into the encyclicals of the church from the 1960s about birth control, but really this attitude towards birth control goes way back to this incubus, succubus kind of thing. And you actually see it spelled out here in these kind of medieval texts. So what I want to do for this podcast is, first of all, we kind of defined the succubus, talk a little bit about, just kind of briefly, I'm going to talk about other kinds of succubus type creatures that we hear about throughout world that have been discussed in other religions or have been discussed in other, folkloric kind of contexts. And then we're going to get into the theology of the succubus and incubus. I promise I'll try not to make that boring. But there's two particular texts I'm looking at, and that is the Malleus Maleficarum. This is also known as the Hammer of Witches. That's what that literally translates to, by Heinrich Kramer and James Sprenger. And they are, this was considered to be like the Inquisitor's manual. I remember when I was a kid, when I first was reading fictional books on, I always liked spooky books, supernatural books, fiction. I mean, it wasn't so much horror. I mean, the whole R.L. Stine thing came, I was a teenager and later when that kind of stuff came out. But the John Bellairs books, for instance, there's one he was one of my favorite authors, and he wrote The House with the Clock in Its Walls, which was a movie that I'm, sorry, I wasn't very, the movie is not something I ever want to see because I already can tell it's completely ruined the actual book. But Bellairs was interesting because he was a Catholic and he was a scholar of Latin literature and so forth. Like he knew about some of these things, which I find makes his children's fiction or YA fiction now, I suppose, so interesting. And in his third book in this one series, there is a witch, in this series. Her name is Mrs. Zimmerman. I love Mrs. Zimmerman. Absolutely love her. But in this third book, she goes off with a friend of one of the original characters, who's a girl. They take a summer vacation up at her, nephew's home or something like that. They basically go off on this vacation. And at some point, she encounters a woman she knew who is now acquired some kind of Solomonic ring and is practicing witchcraft. It's kind of an interesting story. But this woman is trying to do things to her, and Mrs. Zimmerman refers explicitly to the idea that she has to get her copy of the Malleus Maleficarum. And after reading the Malleus Maleficarum, I'm like, do you really want to do that? But of course, Bellairs, that's just pretty much what he would have known it as. Essentially, the authors of the Malleus Maleficarum were. My comment on them is that first of all, you seem to know an awful lot about how satanic pacts are supposed to work, which, and you seem to have an awful lot of real detail about sex. It kind of reminds me of those evangelical things that you would see back in the, in the 80s, when the Satanic Panic was going on, and or they would talk about or talk about music videos and how bad they were, and they'd suddenly get into all these really deep descriptions of kinky sex and stuff, and you're kind of going, why do you know so much about this? I studied it for science. Yeah, it's just, I don't know. There's a creep factor there when you have these people who are telling you, and basically what they're advocating for is certain kinds of tortures and things, which I'm kind of no, this is really just almost like a big S&M racket, of a type. So, I don't know. It's kind of amusing to me. But the book is interesting in as much as it talks about, and it talks literally about incubus and succubus as part of the method of witches, and they do talk about the distinction between those who are, who are becoming witches and therefore engaging in this as part of their ritual or part of their pact or whatever, and those who are innocent victims of it. There's another book that I had acquired years ago called Demonality, and this is by Ludovico Maria Sinistrari, okay, or that might be Ludovico, and this was it was listed as Friar Minor. So again, this is a church documentation, and Demonality actually does have to do with the incubus and succubus. Both of these were translated by Montague Summers, who anybody familiar with witchcraft knows that he's the one who had written, he's one of the authors who wrote the most or a lot on witchcraft, through not only the Inquisition type stuff, but also, the witch trials and things like that. Summers is kind of the authority, you might say, from that particular period of time on these types of topics. Of course, again, he's not coming at it as a practitioner. He's coming at it as, somebody who is probably opposed to or, wanting to, at least document those types of things, but not as somebody who's actually a practitioner doing that kind of a thing. Because he is in fact a reverend. So let's begin here. So first of all, how are these beings supposed to operate? In a nutshell, what happens is the succubus has sex with the female, okay, whether it be as part of this ritual thing or whether it be just a sleeping woman. Perhaps she sees a beautiful man, you know what I mean, in a guise who, a man sees a beautiful woman. We're starting there first. She sees a man sees this beautiful woman, and of course, men supposedly being what they are, right, falls in love with this woman and is drawn into a sexual relationship with this woman. Okay, she's the temptress, right? drawn into this sexual relationship, at which point she harvests semen from him. Now, she herself is barren. Now, this is important, I think. There's this element of barrenness. The succubus can never bear children. So there's this idea that she is some kind of an unnatural female. So that's the first thing you want to think about there, because she can have copious amounts of sex but never actually get pregnant. What she does instead is takes that semen and somehow transfers it to the incubus. Maybe she has sex with the incubus and he takes it from her. That was not really explained, how one transfers from one to the other, presumably by magic of some sort. But the incubus then will appear to a woman, will entice that woman into sexual relations. And when he does so, she will get pregnant, and her spawn is going to be something that is from something that is demonic. And the way that they would identify something that was demonic was by it would have something unnatural, like children who were born deformed, for example, were considered to be children of an incubus or succubus incubus type child. Children who were very vulnerable, they would say, or spiritually open to witchcraft or devil things, were also children of the succubus or the incubus type situation. So again, we have this thing, just like we have with fairy changelings and other things, where this idea of a child with some kind of a birth defect is somehow is demonized, or you're actually a devil child, which is how they would justify either abandoning these children or not taking care of them. So we already see all the problems with this viewpoint. But there's so many other pieces besides that are of interest. It's this idea of this kind of female figure. If we just look at the succubus, this female figure that has sex without procreating, because supposedly she's not able, and in the service of creating more demonic beings, or of creating these children that are creating these imperfections in God's world or whatever. So let's look a little bit at what's actually said in the texts here. The Malleus Maleficarum, I'm in the part 2. I'm just taking my little bookmark off here. Okay. So this is chapter 4. Here follows the way whereby witches copulate with those devils known as incubi. And first of all, there's a whole pre-discussion, I should note, about the fact that demons don't actually have bodies. So so this happens either through possession of a corpse, or they somehow manage to make a body for themselves in some magical fashion, but that they actually are not. They're not actually, they're not like possessed humans, for example. They might be possessed corpses. So they have to do something to make a body for themselves, and an attractive body at that. Because obviously, although it is said that the women will copulate with, these half goat figures, like these satyr type figures. So, which is interesting, because I would think if you were going to be lured in by seduction, that you would be lured in by someone who you're attracted to. But anyway. So it says, as to the method in which witches copulate with incubus devils, 6 points are to be noted. First, as to the devil and the body which he assumes, of what element it is formed. Second, as to the act, whether it is always accompanied with the injection of semen received from some other man. Third, as the time and the place, whether one time is more favorable than other for this practice. Fourth, whether the act is visible to the women, and whether only those who were begotten in this way are so visited by devils. So in other words, if you're the child of an incubus or succubus, you're the one who's going to be picked on, whether that's the case. Fifth, whether it applies only to those who are offered to the devil at birth by midwives. Okay? Now again, the idea of midwives, because there is a section here on midwives and the atrocities they commit with babies, like offering them to the devil and so forth. And those of you who are versed in witchcraft already can see where some of this is going. Sixth, whether the actual venereal pleasure is greater or less in this act. Okay, yes, well, he's finding out how pleasurable it is for science here, or for religion, or whatever. And we will speak of the first matter and quality of the body which the devil assumes. It must be said that he assumes an aerial body, so he's a spirit of the air, and that it is in some respects terrestrial, insofar as it has an earthly property through condensation. And this is explained as follows. The air can not of itself take definite shape, except in the shape of some other body in which it is included. And in that case, it is not bound by its own limits, but those of something else. And one part of the air continues into the next part. Therefore, he cannot simply assume an aerial body as such. Know, moreover, that the air in every way is a most changeable and fluid matter. And a sign of this is the fact that when any have tried to cut or pierce with a sword the body assumed by a devil, they have not been able to, for the divided parts of the air at once join together again. From this, it follows that air is in itself a very competent matter, but because it cannot take shape unless some other terrestrial matter is joined with it, therefore it is necessary that the air which forms the devil's assumed body should be in some way incipitated and approach the property of the earth while still retaining its true property as air. Wow, this is really Aristotelian. And devils and disembodied spirits can effect this condensation by means of gross vapors raised from the earth, and by collecting them together in shapes which they abide, not as defilers of them, but only as their motive power, which gives to the body the formal appearance of life, in very much the same way as the soul informs the body to which it is joined. They are, moreover, in these assumed and shaped bodies, like a sailor in a ship which the wind moves. So the body they assume is just a vehicle. Okay, I don't necessarily want to read this whole thing, but I'm kind of looking through. So it's okay. So when it is asked what sort is the body assumed by the devil, with regard to its material, it is one thing to speak of the beginning of its assumption, and another thing to speak of its end. For in the beginning it is just air, but in the end it is incipitated air, partaking of some of the properties of earth. And all this the devils, with God's permission, can do of their own nature, for the spiritual nature is superior to the bodily. Therefore the bodily nature must obey the devil in some respect of local motion, though not in respect of the assumption of natural shapes, either accidental or substantial, except in the case of some small creatures, and then only with the help of some other agent. But as to local motion, no shape is beyond their power. Thus they can move them as they wish, and in such circumstances as they will. So obviously we're dealing with shapeshifters here. From this may arrive an incidental question as to what should be thought when a good or bad angel performs some of the functions of life by means of true natural bodies. Okay, so he kind of gets into that. Then he gets into how they manage to have conversation, and we don't need to get into that. This is more of that Aristotelian, kind of stuff that comes up here. To return to the point, okay, so they were saying, devils have no teeth or tongues. They can show the latter as well as the teeth and the lips. So there's this whole, I'm just kind of reading through this whole long section on how they form bodies. Okay, so we've gathered that they are spirits of the air that somehow take on some kind of earthly material to form a body. Okay, so then this next section is how in modern times, I tell you, witches perform the carnal act with incubus devils and how they are multiplied by this means. So the principal subject is the carnal act which incubi and an assumed body perform with witches, unless perhaps anyone doubts whether modern witches practice such abominable coitus, and whether witches had their own origin in this abomination. In answering these two doubts, we shall say, as to the former of them, something of the activities of witches who lived in olden times, about 1400 years before the incarnation of our Lord. So, okay, we're getting BC times here. 1400 years, so about 1400 BC, really. It is, for example, unknown whether they were addicted to these filthy practices, as modern witches have been since that time, for so far as we know, history tells us nothing on this subject. Surprising, right? But no one who reads the histories can doubt that there have always been witches, and that by their evil works much harm has been done to men, animals, and the fruits of the earth, and the incubus and succubus devils have always existed. For the traditions of the canons and the holy doctors have left and handed down posterity many things concerning them through many hundreds of years. Yet there is the difference that in times long past the incubus devils used to infest women against their wills, as often shown, and he mentions these texts. But the theory that modern witches are tainted with this sort of diabolical filthiness is not substantiated only in our opinion, since the expert testimony of witches themselves have made all these things credible. Right. So in other words, we asked them, and they said, yeah, we do that. And so therefore, that's credible. And of course, they don't mention the fact that they extract this kind of, credible testimony under torture, but, anyway. That they, not now, as in times past, subject themselves unwillingly, but willingly embrace this most foul and miserable servitude. Okay? I mean, it just sounds like it's just so awful why you would do it voluntarily, but, anyway. How many women have we left to be punished by secular law in various dioceses, especially in Constance? And he mentions these different towns, and, mentions how they've only managed to burn 48 people in that time. And, isn't that a shame? And he says, and there was no question of credulity in accepting their stories because they turned to free repentance. For they all agree in this, namely that they were bound to indulge in these lewd practices in order that the ranks of their perfidy might be increased. Okay. So they are, basically he's saying, they're, as opposed to witches, so the summary of that is, witches in old times, like 1400 years before Christ, obviously did these things, but, these kinds of things happened, but probably with unwilling victims. But now what we are talking about are people very willing to participate. Of course, history doesn't tell us whether they were all willing or unwilling. Okay, so there's this idea that they participate in this, and that part of this, therefore, is these women participating in so these would be women who, willingly have sex with the incubus and bear these demonic kind of children. Okay, so then he asks the question, whether are the relations of an incubus devil with a witch are always accompanied by the injection of semen? To this question, it is answered that the devil has 1,000 ways and means of inflicting injury, and from the first time of his first fall has tried to destroy the unity of the church in every way to subvert the human race. Therefore, no infallible rule can be stated as to this matter, but there is this probable distinction that a witch is either old and sterile or she is not. And if she is, then he naturally associates with the witch without the injection of semen, since it would be of no use, and the devil avoids superfluity in his operations as far as he can. But if she is not sterile, he approaches her in the way of carnal delectation, which is procured for the witch. And should she be disposed to pregnancy, then he can conveniently possess the semen extracted from some man, for he does not delay to approach her with it for the sake of infecting her progeny. Okay, so this is a kind of different version from what is said here, that he is actually, he has sex with a woman who is capable of bearing children, and if a child is formed, then he can conveniently get semen from another man and make it look like it's theirs. I mean, of course, there was no DNA testing back in whenever this was written. But it's, so there's this, so he says, okay, then it's asked whether he's able to collect the semen emitted in some nocturnal pollution in sleep. Boy, they really have a thing against this, right? Just as he collects that which is spent in the carnal act, the answer that is probable that he cannot, though others hold a contrary opinion. For it must be noted that, as has been said, devils pay attention to the generative virtue of the semen, and such virtue is more abundant and better preserved in semen obtained by the carnal act, being wasted in the semen that is due to nocturnal pollutions in sleep. So in other words, if you have a wet dream, if you're a guy and you have a wet dream, your semen is not as good as if you actually used it during sex. Somehow it's different. Okay. So there's so there's these other things about the incubus and how they operate. But one of the things that was interesting is a story that was told in here about a young virgin girl who is taken by an old woman on a feast day. She's brought away up to this room and is told that as she enters the room, she is not to make the sign of the cross. And she tells her that she won't, but she kind of secretly does it anyway. And so when she goes into the room, she sees nothing because she made the sign of the cross, all the devils in front of her vanished, and then the woman cursed her and said, you've made them, why did you make the sign of the cross? Now they've all gone away. So a story which I thought was very interesting because it's the idea, again, of the old wise woman luring the young virgin in to have sex with these demonic beings. So that's certainly something to think about there. Okay, so I don't like I said, I don't want to turn this into a full reading of the Malleus Maleficarum, but you get some of the idea. He goes into a whole lot of detail about the way in which these operations occur, and then of course they have a section on what you're supposed to do about it spoiler alert, it's not. It's quite nasty, but it's there's so there's this whole section on this in the Malleus Maleficarum. So we see this, so we start to see these ideas about these kind of demonic beings that end up impregnating women or men. Well, either having sex with men, okay, and then being able to impregnate women. All the different ways in which the devil can infect a woman with, either, in this case, they're talking about women who willingly participate in witchcraft. Not all of them do. This other book called the Demonality book, Sinistrari, he talks about, he kind of gives the whole idea of how a demonic pact is made. And I'm not going to read through that. But he says after that, that when all rites have been performed in accordance with the instructions of the mystagogues who initiate the novices, these then promise never to worship the Blessed Sacrament, to insult all saints, and especially the Holy Mother of God, to trample underfoot and defile holy images, the cross, and relics of saints. Never to use the sacraments or sacramentals, never to make a good confession to the priest, but to always keep hidden from him their intercourse with the demon. The demon, in exchange, it engages to give them always prompt assistance, to fulfill their desires in this world and to make them happy after their death. The solemn profession thus being made, each has assigned to himself a devil called a magistellus or little master, with whom he retires aside for carnal satisfaction. The said devil assuming the shape of a woman, if the initiated person be a man, the shape of a man, sometimes of a satyr, sometimes of a buck-goat, if it to be a woman who has been received a witch. It says, if we seek to learn from these authorities how it is possible that the demon, who has no body, can perform actual coitus with a man or woman, they unanimously answer that the demon assumes the corpse of another human being, male or female as the case may be, or from that the mixture of other materials, he shapes for himself a body endowed with motion, by means of which body he copulates with the human being. And that when women are desirous of becoming pregnant by the demon, which only concerns with the consent and at the express wish of that said woman, which is interesting. So imagine that. The devil asks for consent. Okay, just think about that. The demon is transformed into a succubus, and during the act of coition with some man, receives therefrom human semen, or else he procures pollution from a man, meaning nocturnal emissions, during his sleep, and then he preserves the split semen at its natural heat, conserving with it the vital essence. So, yeah, so he's does a little lab work on it, apparently. This, when he has connection with the woman, he introduces into her womb, whence follows impregnation. So, at other times also the demon, whether incubus or succubus, copulates with men or women, from whom, however, he receives none of the sacrifices, homage, or offerings which he is wont to exact from wizards or witches, as aforesaid. He is then but a passionate lover, having only one desire, the carnal possession of those whose his lust craves. Of this there are numerous instances to be found in authors of no small repute, amongst whom we read in the case of Menippus Lycius, who long cohabited with a woman, and when she had served him sexually many times and oft, so doted on her that she persuaded him to marry her. But a certain philosopher, who happened to be present at the wedding banquet, having guessed what the woman was, told Menippus that he had to deal with a compusa, that is a succubus. Okay, so this is another name. Whereupon the bride vanished, shrieking and wailing bitterly. Okay, so this is, he's talking about more ancient varieties of female succubus, and also of male incubus. So in other words, if it's not to actually reproduce these demonic beings, then it's very strictly just an act of lust. So that's what this particular friar, Ludovico Sinistrari, actually says. So where does this leave us? One thing I did sort of skipped over here was I did not talk about the other types of, incubus, succubus kinds of, beings that we see prior to Christianity. There are the jinn in Arabian mythology. There are certain jinn that would have the kind of properties of an incubus or a succubus. And the word, and I don't know if I'm going to say this word right, I want to say it's either Karina, that's Qariinah, with this little accent over like a circumflex over the I. It says that this type of being sleeps with the person and has relations during sleep, and as is known by dreams. They are said to be invisible, but a person with second sight can see them, often in the form of a cat, dog, or other household pet. It says there's a spirit which possesses only certain people possessed, and such people cannot marry, or the Akarina will harm them. Yeah, this is almost this idea of, some kind of an attached sexual being that one might have. And as we've noted, there's a vampiric element to this too. Even though we're not talking about drawing blood the way we see with vampires, this is more about the idea that there is still a draining of something, some kind of life element or life force from the being through sex or sexual relations. There's this mention of there's a Buddhist scripture regarding prayer to Avalokiteshvara, the Dharani Sutra of Armogapasha, promises that those you will pray that you will not be attacked by demons who either suck your energy or make love to you in your dreams. Okay, so that's a Buddhist idea. We also see, now it's also been said that in ancient Greece that the idea of the sirens were somewhat comparable to them, although the sirens, you don't really hear about the sirens actually having sex. The sirens are about, they have beautiful voices that lure men to their doom. But this may actually be almost metaphorical in a way, the idea that the beautiful woman who lures you into the bedroom. In Proverbs, I know I wrote about this in my book, there's the part in Proverbs, I want to say it's around Proverbs 5, where they talk about the loose woman who draws the man down to Sheol, down to the pit, which was not at that time considered a place of punishment, but more the idea that you get involved, you get tempted by the beautiful woman, and it's leading to your death in some fashion. And by the time we get to Christianity, obviously it means you're, being condemned to hell. That's the idea that they have. So you have this idea of the woman, who is this temptress. So you see it in different aspects. You see it in the Bible, you see it in other cultures. There's certain amounts of, certain aspects of vampire myths that are connected to this. We have talked in the past about the Lenin Shi and also about the Bavan Shi, like these female figures who will come seduce men. And then, in some cases, in those myths, they might drain their blood, but it's this idea that they are tempting them with their sexuality. Now, obviously, you're going to say to me, "Well, what about Lilith?" Well, yes, that was where I was going next. Is the idea that Lilith, who is in the Talmudic version that was written around the 2nd century CE, Lilith is the first wife of Adam. Created, and if you read Genesis 1, it says male and female he created them. I mean, it doesn't mention Lilith in the Bible, but the idea is that the two of them are co-created almost equally, and that when they go to have sex, Adam wants to be on top, and Lilith says to him, well, why should you be on top? Why can't I? And basically he says, well, that's the way it's supposed to be. I'm supposed to be the guy on top, and Jehovah seems to kind of support Adam in that, and so she just says, well, the heck with you, I'm not doing this, and she takes off. And that's when she meets up with Samael and conspires, and Samael is associated with the serpent in the garden, and so on and so forth. But so this is the Lilith that appears in the Talmudic literature, and she is considered to be a demoness. She's considered to be the one who is the spawner of demons and different things. She's not the only one. We are going to talk about some other ones in some future podcasts, but she's this idea of this demonic being that is there to make life difficult for Adam. Now that he was left, he was given another wife, and to basically rebel against God's creation. So that was her role in this particular, in the Jewish lore. Now Lilith obviously has taken on many other connotations, and I do have a whole separate podcast on Lilith. But Lilith is, in a way, she's usually equated with the original succubus. The idea of this woman who comes at night to steal semen from men to sire, other demons. And that is kind of that's where the Lilith story ends up. That's probably where the origin of the theology comes from, to a certain degree, even though the Christian theology is not, doesn't specifically or explicitly mention Lilith. this idea of the succubus as this female, this very independent female. Okay, so this is another aspect of it too that's not really talked about. Like, a woman who would want to practice witchcraft would be a woman who is, because they never say it. They just act like, really, if you read it in these texts, it sounds like they're going to be subjected to all these miserable, horrible, filthy things, but they do it willingly. Why? Well, there's a couple of theories on that. One, of course, is the whole, the weakness of Eve theory. The idea that because woman gave in to the serpent, that's another aspect of it. Because Eve was tempted by Samael and gives in, that she is somehow therefore weak and vulnerable to these kinds of things. Although, again, the way that they would describe some of these Sabbats, they sound like pure horrors, which they're meant to do. And, of course, no sane person would ever do that, right? But the thing is, being involved with that kind of stuff is something that would give a woman power that she might not have in a kind of relationship where her husband is her lord and master. So this is a way in which women can gain their own power. And one way that you have power is to have power over your own sexuality, right? And to be able to choose to procreate or not at will. Now, obviously, when you read like the Malleus Maleficarum, they talk a lot about procreation, or means of, stopping procreation. And, as I said earlier on, that gets all connected to the whole birth control argument and why the church tends to be opposed to it. But really what the real root of this here is, everything surrounding this. It's not so much that the devil is a woman who is independent is going to breed devil children. That's what she's doing. She's allowing herself to weakly be taken in by a man who's really the devil, or she is acting as a witch and willingly breeding these kinds of demons in the world. Okay, so there's a really interesting set of connections here, and what that says about a woman and a woman's sexual power. That a woman's sexual power is always used when it's not in the service of, traditional marriage and procreation, that it's about spawning evil throughout the world. So this gives us it's certainly an interesting justification for why women should not be in charge of their own sexuality. And again, this is not something that has ended in this day and age. There's still, I'm reminded of the Hobby Lobby decision that was made, and I want to say it was made back in the 1990s. I don't know why. I seem to recall working for one particular employer when I heard about this decision, and that would have been in the late 90s. And it might have been later than that. I can't remember. But it was the Hobby Lobby decision. And one of the reasons I don't shop at Hobby Lobby is that they had decided that this is when you had the whole idea of corporations as people. And in this particular decision, they considered themselves to be a Christian company, and they did not want to pay for birth control for women on health insurance. It was a kind of requirement, and they said, no, we don't want to. We're not paying for women's health insurance. Well, they'll pay for the health insurance, but not for birth control too. And what was explicitly said, if I recall, was something like, we're not going to pay for her to go like whore around, basically. You know what I mean? Like go around and, be promiscuous. But as people have noted, these same companies are perfectly willing to pay for Viagra. And I've had people argue with me and say, well, no, but that's just so a man can procreate. And I'm like, no, you actually can't procreate with Viagra. That's not the way that works. That's a whole separate discussion that might get this banned from YouTube or something. So I'm not going to go into that. But I don't. This is definitely about controlling female sexuality, and what you're seeing here is that we have kind of an association with that. We have an association with, as I've said before, we're very, very protective of female virginity. We're very, very protective about, and one of the reasons, and I know some people, even other women I know who are very empowered, argue with me about this, but I'm like, you realize you're still playing into the idea that female virginity is the thing to be prized, and that, her involvement, her allowing herself to be seduced or allowing herself is somehow dealing with the devil. There's still this kind of idea that you are doing something that is kind of an abomination or that is going to breed abominations. And that was W. Scott Poole's thesis about, like, he feels like even a movie like, The Exorcist being perhaps, one example, even though Reagan, of course, is not bearing a children, her mother is a single mother, right? Her mother's a single mother who's not, and, she and her daughter starts playing around with the Ouija board, because you see the fact that she's the child of a single mother. It's almost like that succubus energy, that independent woman who's witchy, who's divorced, who did not stay subject to her husband, right? Has their child, and this child is now vulnerable to witchcraft. So this child becomes possessed by a devil. Ironically, the devil she's possessed by is the one that's there to protect children. But, in any case, you can see what's behind this. Okay, this is why, from my perspective, and I know this has even upset certain friends of mine, but I said, I am for a woman having full control over her body, using birth control, using the morning after pill, using whatever, and having abortion all the way up to 9 months. It's because, a decision, by the way, if somebody's carried a pregnancy that long, it's not usually because they just change their mind at the last minute. It's because there's some serious thing going on that's probably going to result in the death of the woman. So, and the child, by the way, the child's going to die either way. So the question is, do you save the life of the woman? And a lot of, certainly the church's view on that is no, you don't save the life of the woman. She can die with her child because that's the right thing to do. So we see this whole thing about, this whole idea around women and motherhood. Now, again, we don't know if some of this didn't start as a means of trying to protect motherhood or trying to protect family lines. I've talked about in talk of restless spirits and the restless dead, the Aori, and the idea of these women who die childless becoming some kind of a monster. So again, this is not something unique to Christianity. It is a concept that you see, but I feel like it's very much connected to the idea of maintaining the family line, and in a situation where we are mortal, because remember, a lot of mythology and a lot of religion centers around the fact that we are mortal, that we die. Okay, that death happens, and that there's also certain things that seem to be cyclical or immortal. Again, depends on which worldview you're coming from, whether you believe things go cyclically or whether or not you think life is kind of a linear process and then you're dead and that's it, or that you're going to go to some other physical place or whatever. There's the fact that death exists. The only way to achieve immortality is to bear progeny. Okay, the only way. So in other words, you may be dead, but you'll live on in some sense through your son or your daughter. Okay, so there's this continuing of the line. And the idea of the succubus, or of these figures, these Lilith-type figures, is that the idea is that they're interfering with the family line. That's probably part of the same injunction against infidelity. Although, again, for men, it's not such a big deal, but for women it is, because women are expected to be the ones to sort of, be the bearers of the continuation of this family line. If he decides to do that with several other women, and of course those children, unfortunately, are frequently not treated as equal, or they're treated as lesser because of that, unfortunately. But that's that whole idea of, no, you have to have the family structure, because the family, unless you're a great warrior who's going to be remembered for your deeds, your only way to gain any kind of immortality is to stay within this kind of traditional structure. Okay, that's the way that this is told. Now, again, if there's older stories, different versions, different ideas, we're basically looking back to what we see from the time that there's writing. Once you start to have these kinds of societies where you are organized into hierarchies in particular. Although you will also see in tribal societies where there's a necessity of the tribe being able to, keep itself alive and to survive and so forth, that there's a certain element of this, perhaps for a slightly different reason, that context. But nonetheless, this is all about the survival of families. Now, we don't really live in a time where we need to worry about the survival of families. I mean, it's not the same kind of thing. We don't have the same kind of views on immortality. We have too many people in the world, probably. I mean, whether or not this planet can sustain all of these people. So procreation is now more a matter of choice. Is starting a family the way you want to dedicate your time? Because it's also not a kind of society where the woman can just stay home. And frequently the woman doesn't want to stay home. I mean, shoot, that was the whole 50s thing with Betty Friedan's, the feminine mystique. We're not living in a time and an era where a woman is just satisfied with being at home and raising babies. I mean, some are. I'm not knocking those that do. But a lot of times that's not, or that's something you do for a period of time, and then you want to go off and do other things. It's much more of a patriarchal idea that's something that you're destined for and that you're supposed to do, whereas the men are the ones who are supposed to have all of the learning and so forth. So anyway, this is a little bit, kind of riffing a little bit here, but I think all of these connections are important in understanding the succubus as a motif or as a figure or as something in our culture, what it's associated with in our culture, because it gets back to the ideas about women and women's sexuality and why people feel that women's sexuality is something that needs to be controlled. Okay, the other things I just wanted to also point out, and I know I've mentioned this a little bit, not only is it sex without procreation, but also the idea of barrenness, the idea that these succubi are unable to have children. Okay, so they're not... So how when we always see this idea of when one has a baby, are they having a baby in wedlock? Are they having it out of wedlock? I mean, again, depending on how traditional, shall we say, your worldview is, that may or may not make any difference. Really, in the human context, it doesn't make any difference at all. But in terms of the social, hierarchical, maybe even religious contexts, the idea of whether one is married or not, the status of it is treated differently depending. And the woman who can have continual sex without procreating, there's no punishment for her. There's no child that comes at the end of it. Now, again, depending on the woman's viewpoint, of course, we're all told that women who always have babies, they always want them. Well, that isn't true. And if, and that this idea that a woman is automatically geared towards mothering in that way, and if you're not, that there's somehow, again, here's something unnatural about you. That's why I pointed back at the succubus, like the beautiful woman who is independent, that's not a thing. You know what I mean? Like, that can't be. She has to be some kind of supernatural or demonic creature. You understand? Or the woman, I was having this conversation yesterday about, we've seen people frequently play the, well, either she's pretty or she's smart. Like, you can't possibly be both. And so, so there's this idea that if you're smart women are associated with wisdom, associated more, they could be, I've seen, I am not make it clear, I'm not making this generalization, but I've seen this generalization made. Like, these women are actually more lesbians because they don't, they're more interested in studies than being involved with the man, or they're not going to be as attractive, so, they're going to be kind of your spinsters, which is why I think there was a period of time where if you were a woman who was a school teacher, you couldn't be married. Okay, you had to commit yourself to celibacy, just like a nun would, because a woman with knowledge is somehow a woman who therefore should not be sexual. Now you see where this is coming in, and that a woman who is pretty somehow is, has no mind for anything, so she's easy prey or whatever. Or just, or ideally she's very suitable, as Jung would say, to be the container of all of the male projections. So yeah, you're as we start to deconstruct these things, we can see in this figure where this becomes this kind of issue. But the idea that she's barren, because ultimately, again, what's the way that womanhood is defined in these things? Her ability to be a mother. And if you're not able to be a mother, if you're barren, then there becomes that kind of sinister connection. And, so this is kind of the force behind the narrative here. This is what people are seeing, and this is very likely what it comes out of. Now, I've talked quite a lot, but there's one last thing I want to talk about, which I found was so interesting as I was doing some research for this podcast, and that is a National Institute of Health. This is American, NIH is, a government institution that actually has an article on the succubus, which is now, of course, regarded, people who claim to be attacked by succubus. I mean, yes, there is the whole sleep paralysis thing and so forth. And by the way, I do talk about that in my podcast on night hag syndrome, which is one of my early ones. This is actually from an NIH article that was written, and it's on the government website. It says, succubus is also known as a demon female lover who approaches males in their dreams to have sex. This is the phenomenon rarely described in psychiatric literature. Yeah, no kidding. It's more identified as a cultural belief in different religions. They report on 2 cases diagnosed with schizophrenia who reported this rare phenomenon of succubus as part of their psychopathology, and then they discuss this phenomenon. So they actually give 2 case studies of men who, in this first case, I'm not going to read the whole case, but he said, on mental status examination, the patient appeared to be very much distressed with his psychopathology. He described the phenomenon of auditory hallucination, commanding and discussing type, and thought broadcast. In addition, the patient explained that at night, when he would go to his bed, he could feel the sensation of being touched by a female whom he would describe as a good-looking woman. He would be able to feel his private parts being touched, leading to erection and ejaculation. As per patient, he did not want this experience. This would happen against his will, would feel guilty about having such an experience and having sexual contact with an unknown female, as he was fully convinced about having such an experience. Very occasionally, he would get up from the sleep after this experience and remain distressed and fearful. In his explanation, he had a strong belief that a quote-unquote witch was doing so, but we would not be able to point out the exact figure of quote-unquote witch. His cognitive functions were intact and he had poor insight. And so they had said that he had not had, there was no history of narcolepsy, insomnia, hypersomnia, sleep terrors, etc. Based on the available information, a diagnosis of schizophrenia was considered. Okay, now case 2, this is a 24-year-old male who was using cannabis in a dependent pattern, presented with an insidious onset and continuous illness of 2 years duration. Okay, and they talk about these different things. He ascribed the voices heard to one of his female teacher, who would express her love toward him in the conversation heard as part of auditory hallucinations. He also described tactile hallucinations to the same teacher. He described this as a sensation of vibration which he would feel all over his body, more so in his thighs and genital region. This would occur mainly at night when he would be fully awake or asleep and alone, and would feel aroused and simultaneously hear the voice of the teacher claiming to be responsible for these sensations. As per him, he would hear that she is in deep love with him and wanted to have intercourse with him, feel his member to be touched, and in the process would have erection, etc. He would be unable to describe exactly how she would be doing this, but was convinced that it was she who was doing so. He also believed his body was under the control of his teacher, who forces him to indulge in sexual activities against his will. He would deny drawing any pleasure out of these activities and say he was not able to avoid this experience. It was not associated with active cannabis use or abstinence from cannabis. At time of a mental examination, his cognitive functions were preserved and he had poor insight. So this is interesting. These are 2 that ultimately, based on the available information, they said this one also was a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So it's interesting how in modern psychology, just as they will take something called possession syndrome, in which one thinks they're demonically possessed, as a type of schizoid event, so therefore they're also considering those who believe to be actually attacked by a succubus to be suffering from this, if they've not identified it as sleep paralysis or as something else. So very interesting. Although schizophrenia is yet another rabbit hole that one could go down, because the question is, there's obviously certain very distressing presentations of that kind of an illness, but there's also a lot about it that, I don't know. I know I have a lot of questions about it, and I think other people do too, about how much is the schizophrenic just simply hallucinating, and how much are they actually having insight into something that other people can't see? Whether this would be part of that or not, I don't know. I mean, obviously, the reality, other than the psychological reality of such a thing, or whether it's really just the way in which fantasy can become really embodied, I don't know. It's all really very interesting to consider, but these are all treated now as hallucinations. Truthfully, if you read back to these other texts, they also treat them as hallucinations, but somehow with very, very real results. Obviously, if you were dealing with an actual succubus who's harvesting your semen, I don't think there's any way you're going to know that. Although that could be a very interesting paternity argument. It wasn't me, it got harvested from me, when the DNA test shows up that it's yours, was that Maury Povich? Was he the one who would do that? You are the father? Yeah, that'd be an interesting one. No, I was actually attacked by a succubus who gave my stuff to an incubus, and that's how she actually became pregnant. So that's why you think it's mine. Yeah, somebody's going to use that argument now. And maybe they'll be classed as schizophrenic. I don't know. Anyway, it's just some interesting things to think about. But what I find really interesting about the whole succubus argument, incubus succubus idea, first of all, it's this idea, the way in which pleasures of the flesh are considered to be, problematic, either, from a sinful perspective, because somehow you are breeding the devil's spawn, which probably goes back to the idea of not properly extending the family line, which is why you have other things like incest, for example, as being problematic. I mean, for biological reasons, but also this idea that you are corrupting or, perverting the family line in some way. And this may have been an excuse as well for dealing with children who had certain kinds of defects, or if you had this may have been also the idea that was what the Malleus Maleficarum was trying to say, like, oh, well, if a girl is actually a child of a succubus, then are they going to come to her and that therefore make her more susceptible to wanting to be independent, or wanting to be a witch, or wanting to engage in these things, or get engaged in carnal pleasures. Because, as human beings, we don't naturally want any of that, right? So, interesting stuff, and a lot to think about there in terms of the way in which which sex becomes this kind of demonized thing, and through these figures that are, and again, they're also this idea that, you're doing it against your will in some fashion, although in case of witches, obviously they're doing it very much in cahoots with the devil, or with the demonic figures, or whatever. But again, what's really behind this? It has this idea of, female sexuality has to be controlled. And if we think about the reasons why, which may or may not have made sense at that time, they certainly don't make any sense now. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to visit all of my work, my website is Chthonia.net. I will probably have a little plug at the beginning of this podcast, but also right now I'll plug again. Please subscribe at patreon.com/Chthonia if you would like more material from me. If you would like, I'm starting to offer courses. I've upped what I'm offering on membership. So please check it out and see if you are interested in this material and you would like to learn more from me, more material that's not going to be shared outside of the Patreon, and more classes and so forth. Or if you just want to take classes that I will be offering to others but get them for free as part of your membership, or get them as part of your membership, definitely check the page out. Check me out on social media, Chthonia Podcast, one word on Twitter and Instagram, 2 words on Facebook. And if you're not watching this on YouTube, my YouTube channel is just Chthonia. Thanks so much, and till next time.